Welcome to the Free Library of Philadelphia. My name is Claudia Balderston, and I am a reader. To quote our most esteemed guest this evening, Richard Russo, reading is a reward. Reading takes you places you've never been, introduces you to people you would never otherwise have a chance to meet. But most of all, at least for me, reading prods you to reflect upon the world around you. Mr. Russo, like Wallace Stegner before him, takes everyday people and places them in common situations such that we feel we are sitting, say, in a booth of our own at the Empire Diner. His empathy and depth of understanding of the quintessentially American human condition is unparalleled in modern fiction. And then there's his gorgeous prose. To mark the awarding of the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for Empire Falls, the Pulitzer Committee noted Mr. Russo's, quote, peerless affinity for the human tragicomedy, unquote, noting his, quote, claims on small-town, blue-collar, heart of the country, unquote. In addition to writing a string of much-heralded novels, he is also a short storyist, writer, a memoirist, a screenwriter, and a teacher. His best-selling novel, Nobody's Fool, was adapted into a feature film starring Paul Newman. Mr. Russo's richly detailed memoir, Elsewhere, took my breath away. His writing is at once infinitely personal, yet speaks to universal experience. As a follow-up to Nobody's Fool, his most recent novel, Everybody's Fool, revisits our old friend, world-worn protagonist, Sully, and his cabal of fellow North Bath, New York denizens. I found this sequel more hopeful than its predecessors. Is tonight's guest a hero? Is he softening in his later years? Mr. Russo's latest effort, a collection of in-depth stories, Trajectory, explores territories well outside his traditional milieu, focusing variously on a professor, a realtor, an academic, and a novelist. The Boston Globe called the collection, quote, so rich and flavorsome that the temptation is to devour it all at once. I cannot in good conscience advise otherwise, unquote. I'm hoping that someday Mr. Russo's interest is sufficiently piqued by our fair but complex city that he will choose to spend some more time here focusing his critical eye on us so that we may better understand ourselves. We are honored to have him here with us this evening. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Richard Russo to the Free Library.
I've been on the road for a while. This is my last, I think this is the last time, at least for a while, that I will be talking about Everybody's Fool. So thank you all for coming. Can you all hear? All right. What I thought I would do tonight, something a little different. Need to keep my eye on my watch here. I thought I would read something from Nobody's Fool to start, a short passage, and then a short passage from Everybody's Fool, and then we'll see where we are, and then maybe another even shorter passage. Not many sequels are written 23 years apart. That's why I thought I would read from the first one. We can see just how much water is under the bridge. The other way you could do that, probably the quicker way to do that, would be to just look at the author photos. But we'll read just a little bit from the first one. There's a symbol in the first, and I'll just a couple of symbols, and you'll figure it out when I get to them. That not verbal symbols, but I'll let you know. Okay, here we go. This is from Nobody's Fool, 1992. A block down the street from Hattie's, two city workers were taking down the banner that had been strung across Main Street since September, where it had become an object of much discussion and derision. Things are looking in Bath, it said. Some of the town's residents claimed that the banner made no sense because of the arrow. Had a word been left out? Was the missing word hovering in midair above the arrow? Clive Peoples, whose idea the slogan had been, was deeply offended by these criticisms and publicly remarked that this had to be the dumbest town in the world if the people who lived there couldn't figure out that the arrow was a symbol for the word up. It worked, he explained, on the same principles as I Heart New York, which everybody knew was the cleverest promotional campaign in the entire history of promotional campaigns, turning a place that nobody even wanted to hear about into a place that everybody wanted to visit. Anybody could see that the slogan was supposed to read, I love New York, not I heart New York. The heart was a symbol, a shortcut. Well, the citizenry of Bath were not fetched by this argument. To most of them, it didn't seem that the word up needed to be symbolically abbreviated, brevity being the word's most obvious characteristic to begin with. After all, the banner stretched all the way across the street, and there was plenty of room for a two-letter word in the center of it. In fact, Clive Jr.'s opponents on the banner issue confessed to being less than taken with the I Heart New York campaign as well. They remained to be convinced that Upstate was much better off for it. And now, after 3 years of this new banner, the local merchants along Main Street still remain to be convinced that things were looking in Bath either. They were waiting for something tangible, like the reopening of the Sans Souci or the groundbreaking on the Ultimate Escape Fun Park. The new banner, Go Sabertooths, Trounce Schuyler Springs, was even more optimistic. The choice of the word trounce was more indicative of the town's mounting frustration with the basketball team's losing streak to Schuyler Springs than a realistic goal. The more traditional beat had been rejected as mundane and unsatisfying. The real debate had been between trounce and annihilate. Proponents of annihilate had surrendered the field when they were reminded that it was a 10-letter word. And Bath was a town that had recently established a precedent when it abbreviated the word up. The banner also promised to revive another controversy, this one turning on a point of grammar. Nearly 3 decades earlier, when football had to be dropped due to a post-war decline in the region's population, and the high school's other sports began to show signs that they would no longer be able to compete successfully against arch-rival Schuyler Springs, the high school's principal had decided that it was time to change the school's nickname, the Antelopes, to something more ferocious sounding in the hopes of spurring Bath's young athletes to greater ferocity. After all, there weren't any antelope within 1,500 miles of Bath, and all those animals were famous for was running away. So, there had been a name the team contest, and the saber-toothed tigers were born. All the antelope logos repainted at town expense. Predictably, the whole thing had not turned out well. The fans immediately shortened the name to the Tigers, which the high school principal thought uncommon and uninspiring and a violation of the contest rules. The best thing about the saber-toothed tiger was its saber teeth, which ordinary tigers didn't have. And the principal insisted that the name not be corrupted, even in casual conversation. He had spent good money repainting all those logos, even if the saber teeth had turned out looking like walrus husks. If all of this wasn't enough, Controversy had erupted on the editorial pages of the North Bath Weekly Journal over whether the plural of saber-tooth should be saber-tooths or saber-teeth. When the cheerleaders led the spell cheer, how should it go? The principal said that saber-teeth sounded elitist and silly and dental. The chair of the high school's English department disagreed, claiming that this latest outrage was yet another symptom of the erosion of the English language, and he threatened to resign if he and his staff were expected to sanction tooths as the plural of tooth. Why not? The public librarian asked in the next letter to the editor. Wasn't this, after all, the same English department that had sanctioned antelopes as the plural of antelope? The letters continued to pour in for weeks. Burrell peoples who had nursed a 28-year grudge against the principal for caving in and allowing history courses in the junior and senior high school to be redesignated social studies had the last editorial word, reminding her fellow citizens that the saber-toothed tiger was an extinct animal. Food, she suggested, for thought. Okay. That's Nobody's Fool. Fast forward now, 23 years in real time, in authorial time, and in real time, 23 years, only 10 years in fictional time, because Everybody's Fool takes place 10 years after the concluding events of Nobody's Fool. But in real time, 23 years have elapsed, so you can just imagine, just how things have changed. All right, so this is from Everybody's Fool, 2016. A banner was strung across Main Street for the Memorial Day weekend. The new North Bath, it said, partnering for tomorrow. This was the brainstorm of Gus Moynihan, the town's new mayor, who had been swept into power the previous year on a tidal wave of born-again optimism more than a decade after the demise of the Ultimate Escape Fun Park, an economic catastrophe that had ushered in a golden age of self-loathing and fiscal pessimism deeply rooted in 2 centuries' worth of invidious comparison to Schuyler Springs, its better-looking twin and age-old rival. Schuyler had long possessed everything to which Bath aspired: a vibrant local economy, an educated citizenry, visionary leadership, throngs of seasonal downstate visitors, an NPR affiliate radio station. Okay, sure, there had been some shitty luck involved. Bath's mineral springs had mysteriously dried up over a century ago, while Schuyler's continued to percolate up enthusiastically from its shale. Schuyler also had a famous thoroughbred racetrack, an acclaimed writer's retreat, and a center for the performing arts, a high-tone liberal arts college. Bath had only a beleaguered 2-year community college, as well as a dozen fancy restaurants that served exotic foods like ramps, whatever they were. On the restaurant front, all that Bath could boast was the rundown Roadhouse Tavern, the White Horse, and Hattie's Lunch, and a donut shop, and the new Applebee's out by the freeway exit. What all of this amounted to, everyone agreed, was a complete economic and cultural rout. For a while, the fun park had gotten people's hopes up, but when they were dashed, the collective despair was so profound that the town had even stopped stringing the buoyantly optimistic Main Street banners that had become its dubious trademark, the last of which had read, "Things are looking in Bath." The gloom had lasted until Gus Moynihan, a retired college professor who was renovating one of the grand old Victorians on Upper Main Street, wrote a guest newspaper editorial decrying the town's mordant defeatism and criticizing the current Republican administration's unspoken policies, which could be summed up, he claimed, in 9 words. No spending. None. Ever. On anything. Under any circumstances. Why not string one last banner across the street, he said. It would read, "Let's eat dirt." Well, the editorial had struck a chord and made a mayoral candidate of its author. Even his opponents had to admit that Gus and his cronies, many of them from away, had run a clever campaign. Let's be Schuyler Springs was the gist of it. Instead of competing with their obnoxious neighbor, why not take advantage of its proximity? Half of the people who came to the racetrack and Performing Arts Center in the summer had no place to stay and ended up in hotels as far away as Schenectady. Why shouldn't they stay in Bath? Okay, the Sanssouci Hotel and Resort, with its nearly 300 rooms, had run into legal difficulties, fueled by local resentment when it became known that the new owners would be using downstate contractors and labor for just about everything. The old hotel's lavish renovations had cost far more and taken much longer than expected, causing it to miss much of the summer tourist trade that first season. And the locals had steadfastly refused and rebelled against the prices at its fancy restaurant. But that didn't mean that the basic concept was flawed, or so the Moynihan crowd had argued. Instead of throwing up roadblocks to entrepreneurship, the town should have offered tax breaks and other incentives. Same deal with restaurants. During the short summer season, desperate, hungry travelers even mobbed the horse. So why not entice a young chef or two up from New York City, find out what the hell ramps were, and serve them, if that's what people really craved? It wasn't like Schuyler Springs had cornered the world ramps market and refused to share. Overnight, the new byword was partnering. Wherever possible, Bath would not only partner with odious Schuyler Springs and moneyed downstaters, but also with local entrepreneurs in projects of exceptional merit. One of these locals was Carl Roebuck, who most people were surprised to learn was an entrepreneur, having known him all their lives as a con man and an asshole. Carl's father, Kenny, they had liked. He had built tip-top construction from nothing by working 14-hour days. Like so many men of his generation, he hoped that his son wouldn't have to work quite so hard. On that score, he had no legitimate worries. In college, Carl had learned to drink and seduce women and spend his father's money, and to loathe all things Carhartt, especially that brand's connotation of hard, honest labor. Returning home, he gave no indication that he meant to work at all, if he could help it. Okay, that's everybody's fault. And, okay, I'm going to read one more short section. We have time. I'm going to read one more short section because it introduces the new hero of this book. Sully, the main character of the previous book, was 60 when it took place and is 70 now in this book. And it seemed to me that I had, much as I loved the character, based as he was on my own father, much as I loved the character, it seemed to me that I needed a new central character for this book. And so I chose a really, really minor character, the dumb cop from the first book, Officer Raymer, who was played so memorably in the movie of Nobody's Fool by Philip Seymour Hoffman in his first major studio role. It was a small part, but he owned it. And So I thought I would make him the main character of this new book, and this will just give you a little introduction to him 10 years later. When I started writing the book and was thinking about this, I thought, God, would he even be a cop anymore? Because he's such an awful cop in that first book. Would he even be a cop anymore? And then I thought, no, of course he'd be the chief of police. That's what. It's the way things work, right? Okay. So here's Officer Raymer, now Chief of Police Raymer. Raymer, groggy, was sitting in the middle of his office sofa, his hands tented over his boxers. He had worn briefs his whole life, until he disrobed in front of Becca for that first time, and she had reacted to them with startled revulsion. Well, she said, that's going to have to change. Apparently, it had been an ironclad policy. She dated only men who wore boxers. His sleeveless undershirts had to go as well. He hadn't really minded switching to boxers, though they took some getting used to, given how they bunched up and gapped at the fly, which was why he now had tented his hands over them. What did it mean, though, that he hadn't gone back to briefs now that Becca was gone? The sad truth was that during their short marriage together, he had learned to defer to Becca in most matters. She had switched him from Colgate to Crest, from Listerine to Scope, from Arid to Right Guard. Free now to return to his own preferences, he discovered that they had come to match. Maybe that's what marriage meant. Except that in theirs, it had been a one-way street. He couldn't think of a single behavior of Becca's that he had altered in the slightest. But perhaps that was because there was so little that he had wanted to change, whereas she had evidently viewed him as a fixer-upper from the start. As if he were structurally sound, the sort of property that you wouldn't mind owning after you had completed all of the necessary renovations. First, though, you would have to gut it, which was pretty much how Raymer had felt by the end, as if the overhaul of his person had come in over budget, and the person footing the bill was having serious second thoughts. To judge by her expression, the woman now standing over him in her off-duty attire, tight jeans and a halter top, in all rather provocative, apparently she agreed. It was as if by studying him, she could envision all the improvements that Becca had tried to make and was calculating how much work would be required, what it would take to finish the job so poorly begun, and whether it would just make more sense to start over and just gut him again. How was it possible that two women with so little in common had come to share such an unflattering assessment? Okay.
Hi, how are you? Thanks
good.
for coming.
Well, thank you.
I'm glad you read that part about Carl because he's such a more sympathetic character in the second novel, and I wondered how much more thinking you did about him. I mean, a lot of it is from his point of view, so I guess you had to really flesh it out a little bit. Thanks.
Yeah. It's funny because when his 23 years elapses, and I hadn't been thinking about him at all during those 23 years. I hadn't been thinking about any of these characters, and really in those 23 years. But if you're going to pick up a character that much longer, you would like to see that. You would like to have evidence of water under the bridge because, of course, there's water under all of our bridges over that period of time. So you never want to pick up a character, or you seldom want to pick up a character 23 years later without that sense of at least, some change. And so when we meet Ruth in this book, Sully's paramour from the earlier book, you don't want her in the same place that she was in before. And I felt that the same thing was true with Carl. And I don't know at what point I began to see him more sympathetically, but I think your point that you make about point of view is really the issue. Is that when you see people through other people's eyes, that's one thing. But when you spend some time in their skin, that makes them much more sympathetic. We're all much more sympathetic to ourselves, right? And when you, it's one thing to look at a character, and it's another thing to look through a character. And so it was especially the last scene that Carl is in, where he's having that conversation with the wife who has left him, and you're looking at things through his eyes. There was really little choice but to kind of, he doesn't see himself as an asshole, regardless of what everybody else does. And so seeing, and this is a man who 23 years later is beginning to have serious misgivings about everything, as most of us do at a certain point.
Hearing you read, I feel like your own delight in what you've written feels really evident. And no, I mean that in a positive, really charming way.
No,
but I was wondering.
No, I understand what you're saying. I'm having way too much fun here.
Yeah, well, and I was curious if that's something that you're aware of and experience when you're in the process of writing.
Yes. It's so embarrassing to admit, but on good days I do crack myself up. And because it's not like these things are running through my brain all the time. It has to be a good day. These books take me, most of them, roughly 5 years, and I take a certain amount of care in peopling them with characters that I think I'm going to have a good time with. Because characters in fiction, if you're going to be with them for 5 years, are a lot like people in real life. You just don't want to surround yourself with bores. And so I do find myself having a lovely time with them, and they surprise me. And the embarrassment, of course, when you crack yourself up, and the embarrassment of having more fun than you probably should with your characters is of course that they come from you. But once they're out there, they begin to have a life of their own, and then I'm cracking up at them, and they take on that life for me that is independent of me, and I'm capable of looking at them as not as part of myself, but as entities of their own, with their own agendas and their own point of view, and their own hopes and fears in this world. And I have also been on the road for a while with this new book of short stories of mine. So I haven't really. It's been a month since I've looked at this particular book or read anything from it, and really that's about all it takes for me to go back and find myself smiling again at these people that I spent a lot of time with and enjoyed their company. And so I have probably more fun than I should.
I've enjoyed reading your books, the academic strain that runs through them. And one of the things that came out in Everybody's Fool is at the very beginning when Raymer starts talking about the rhetorical triangle. Mm. And he wants to know who he is. Mm-hmm. Does that come from your academic background, that you would bring something that most people don't think about very often, like the rhetorical triangle?
Well, I was an English teacher for a long time, so I taught the rhetorical triangle on more than one occasion. But really where that comes from, Miss Burrell, 10 years dead is still in a way writing in Raymer's margins, because he can't forget, over the years, her insistence that he is somebody, and he ought to find out who he is, when he wanted to respond to her, "I'm nobody," Why are you troubling over me? Why don't you just let me drift like all my other teachers do? Why are you paying attention to me in this way? Which struck me as a wonderful premise for a middle-aged man who has been told his entire life by virtually everybody that he is a fool. And Miss Burrell is perhaps the one person who has demurred in that opinion, and has always tried to find his better and indeed smarter self. So that was part of it. But the other thing that was perhaps more important to me was that the rhetorical triangle that Raymer is trying to puzzle his way through at this point in kind of middle age. What is he, 40-something, I guess, late 30s, early 40s. This rhetorical triangle that he's talking about gave me a chance to speak with my audience about how the best writing really works in that triangle of where certainly stories can be lost if you're not thinking about your audience at some point. It's very important to think about whether is your audience having as good a time as you are. Somewhere along the line, you should really be thinking about that as a writer. And you should be thinking about what your subject is. Usually about halfway through every book I write, I'll have that moment in which I think to myself, okay, I know what this book is about now. And it usually can be something very, very simple. With Empire Falls, I was maybe halfway through the book, and I knew that it had various themes in it, and there was a figure, something, a pattern was beginning to emerge. But at some point, about halfway through, I had this revelation about it, that the subject matter, the simplest subject matter that I could describe of this book was cruelty. This was a book about cruelty. And when a writer has that kind of, and it might seem obvious now, but it wasn't obvious at all then. When a writer has that kind of realization, then the rest of the book becomes simpler, because if it's not about cruelty, and you can't go too far from straying from that general topic without losing intuitively your readers. So understanding what your subject is very important. Paying attention to your audience is very important. But who is Douglas Raymer, which is what Miss Burrell keeps asking him, is important too for a writer. And it was important to me to come at it obliquely in this book, because for me it was the last piece of the puzzle. When I was a graduate student trying to learn how to become a writer, I got the other two sides of the triangle first. I had learned how to use my tools. I had learned what my tools were. I had learned how to use them. I knew how to develop characters, and I knew the ins and outs of point of view, and I knew that it was conflict that was going to drive my story, I had a theoretical understanding of tone, and I had learned to write dialogue. These are all the tools in a writer's toolkit. The last piece of the puzzle for me was figuring out who I was, because there were lots of writers that I admired, and I would have loved to have been any of them. I was reading Cheever at the time, and I thought, boy, that's a good person to be. I'll be John Cheever, or I'll be Raymond Chandler. That was an even better person to be, to my mind, to my way of thinking, because I wanted to write about urban settings, and I wanted to write about dames, and I wanted to write about corruption. I didn't know anything about any of those things, but I thought Raymond Chandler would be a good person to be. And there were half a dozen other authors that I admired, to the depths of my soul, and thought, well, this would be a good writer to be. And of course, I couldn't be any of those writers because I wasn't any of those writers, and I didn't have their backgrounds. And so in a very fundamental way, even after a point where I'd learned how to use all of my tools, I had no idea who Richard Russo was. Which is another way of saying that I hadn't come to terms with some fairly simple things like who and what do you love and why. For me, that was the last piece of the puzzle to become a writer, was to figure that out. When I sit down in front of a blank piece of paper, as opposed to, the person who talks, when you talk to your spouse in the morning, or your friends, or your children, that's one person. But who are you when you sit down to write? Who and what do you love? That was the last piece of the puzzle for me. And you would think that would be the first piece, wouldn't it? Wouldn't you think you'd have to know that before you could learn anything else? But in fact, for most writers, it's the last. And it made perfect sense for me that a man like Raymer, whom everybody believes is a fool, and he has come to believe that he's a fool, it made perfect sense to me that a man could be middle-aged, has already married and lost a wife, feels that he's a horrible cop and a worse chief of police, and all of it comes down to the fact that he has no idea who he is, what and who he loves, and why. So that's what that's the long answer, but that's what the rhetorical triangle in this book was all about. Was me kind of, feeling my way around those issues.
You mentioned a couple of times about your relationship with your characters in Nobody's Fool and Everybody's Fool. Of all those characters, if you could pick one to hang out with, who would it be?
Well, obviously, who would I hang out with? Sully. Sully was based on my father, and my parents separated when I was young, so I didn't get to know my father until I was 18, at which time I was legal to drink in New York back then. And it wasn't that long after that. We had a few summers together. I would come home from college and we would work road construction together. But we had a few summers together. I went off and became a teacher and was trying to become a writer. And it wasn't that long, after really finally getting to know him, that he became ill. And when he died, I was still a relatively young man. He died before my first novel was ever published, so he never got to see any of those blessings of my life. So I kind of felt like I just never got my fill of the man. And so writing Nobody's Fool was an opportunity for me to spend another 4 or 5 years in his company. Same thing in Everybody's Fool. Although by that time he was kind of a cross between my father and Paul Newman, truth be told. My mother saw the movie. My mother, who divorced my father, saw the movie. And, well, first she said, when she read the book, she said, I like him so much better on the page. And then when she saw the movie, she said, I had no idea he was so good looking. But he was a wonderfully entertaining man, a bullshitter of the first order. And his friends. He had friends like Carl Roebuck and Rubb, so yeah, he was just a gas to be around.
Thank you so much for coming. I have 2 questions to you. How do you make your flawed characters so likable? And my second question: what would you like your audience to take away from your books?
How do I make my characters so likable? I think the short answer to that is that I like them. And why do I like them? If the short answer is that I like them, why do I like them? Well, I have very few hard and fast philosophical convictions, but one of them is that we are all, I think, the thing that we all have in common is a capacity for extraordinary foolishness. It's what makes us It's what makes us human. And we go through life seeking out dignity that doesn't really jibe terribly well with the fact that on so many occasions, on any given day, we just do the damnedest foolish things. And the first thing that you do is foolish, and maybe it's foolish in a small way, or maybe you think nobody sees it, and so you try to cover it up, and with each time you cover it up, you magnify it, and before long, everybody knows, just how foolish you are and what degree of foolishness you're capable of. And that's what makes us so entertaining to ourselves and to others. It's the way I see not individual people, it's the way I see all of us, and it's certainly the way I see the first person that I see every day in the mirror. I certainly do not exempt him from the foolishness of mankind. I try not to. I think sometimes not liking people is the result of judging them, and I try not to judge my characters. It's hard sometimes. Those of you who have read this book and have spent some time with Roy Purdy know what I'm talking about. But for the most part, I make my characters likable by liking them myself. I like my fellow humans even when it's a trying, sometimes ordeal to do so. In these times, especially. What do I want people to take away? That's kind of up to you. Here's what I would like. If you sit down to one of my books, I would like for you to dream so deeply of this alternate world, the world that is different from the world that you live in on the other hours of your day. I would like you to dream so deeply that dream that when the alarm rings or you realize that you have to get up and cook dinner or you have to pick up the kids or whatever in your real life intrudes on the dream that I want you to dream, I would like for you to come up out of that dream kind of blinking the way you do when you come up out of water, and you think, oh yeah, I remember this is my real life. But you've been somewhere else. And that's why I don't want, the last thing I would want any of you to be thinking about, for instance, is me, the person who's spinning the story. That's like, pay no attention to that man behind the curtain. If you're thinking about me, you're not dreaming deeply enough. So I want you to dream really deeply. But that also means that, when the dream is finally broken, and you finish Everybody's Fool or another novel of mine, and you set it down, what would I want you to take away? Well, I would hope that this world is real enough to you that even when you finish it, you find yourself in the days and weeks ahead to be reminded from time to time of the book, and maybe even to think that, you know what? I got really caught up in the entertainment of all of this, but it was actually about something, something that maybe I wasn't aware of it when I was reading it, because I was dreaming so deeply. But maybe there was more going on in this book than meets the casual eye. If you come away with first having dreamt deeply and then wanting to think about it more afterwards, whatever your conclusions might be are your own. But if you find yourself thinking about it a week or 10 days or a month later, that would make me very, very happy indeed.
I just finished your book of short stories, enjoyed it very much. And I've had this burning question since I read it. What kind of nightmare did you have to inspire that bacon scene?
It was no nightmare at all. A student told me. There's a scene in one of my long short stories in this book that's come out in which the characters the students in the main character's class have come to class very drunk. It's the last Tuesday before Thanksgiving weekend, as I recall. And they've all stayed up very late, got very drunk, and they've gone to a bacon party. See, I'm going to add you. You didn't think you were going to learn anything tonight, but you are. And this was, I was a teacher at Colby College at the time, and the student told me about this party that they had, and you get a pound of bacon. Everybody gets their hands, you get all the grease you can, you squeeze the bacon, pass it on to the next person, and you slick back your hair. Men and women alike, and then you put on kind of 50s, early 60s rock and roll. So it's not a nightmare at all. This is simple verisimilitude. I had a question. I was doing an event with the great short story writer Richard Bausch about a month ago, and he was doing a Q&A. Actually, he was going to a bookstore, an event at a bookstore where he didn't know anybody. His first time at the bookstore, and he got an email from an old friend of his that he hadn't seen in a long time. He said, "I hear you're in town at such and such books, and I'm going to be there." And Richard thought, "Great, terrific. At least I'll have, there'll be a friendly face there when I come in." And Richard has just started to read, and his friend came in, and he recognized him, despite the fact that it had been years since he'd seen him. He recognized him. And so he gave his reading, and at the end he said, Q&A came along, and he said, "All right, does anybody have any questions?" And his old friend raised his hand, and Richard said, that's a good friend that will ask the first question, because the first question is always the hardest. So he asked his friend, "Yes, Todd, whatever, and Todd, yes, you have a question." And his friend stood up and said, "How much do you weigh?"
If you were to have a private audience at the invitation of the president, and you were in an intimate conversation with him and maybe sharing some good food and good wine, what book might you suggest, or would you have brought with you?
We're not talking about Barack Obama here now, right? We're talking about...
When I speak about the president, I think it's...
Who would recommend a book to Donald Trump? I doubt he's even read The Art of the Deal. No, I'm not saying... That sounds incredibly snarky, but he's kind of famous for not reading, right? For not reading books.
Don't let me stop you.
Hi, I wanted to ask you about Empire Falls. I love the book, and I love the TV adaptation. Mm-hmm. I'm wondering what you thought of how the TV, how it was realized on TV.
I liked it a lot. I had really only one misgiving about that, and that was the person that they chose to write the screenplay, and that was me. I thought that everybody involved in the HBO production brought a wonderful freshness to it. Fred Skepsey, the director, I thought was perfect. When they told me it was going to be Ed Harris, I couldn't believe it, because the character that I had described in the book, if you're going to cast based on my physical description, it probably would have been, I don't know, James Gandolfini or somebody like that, because this is a man who has been literally eating his mistakes for like 25 years. And here they cast trim little Ed Harris in the role. But I went to the set fairly early on and saw a scene between Miles and his beloved daughter. It's an early scene in the diner, I'm like 2 minutes into the scene, and I'm thinking, well, this is the perfect casting, because Harris was so brilliant, and on never mind the dialogue, what he was saying to his daughter, the haunted look he had on his face with all of the Tick Roby scenes was he had captured the dread, not only the love, but the dread that I felt when my daughters were Tick's age, and that the world was going to have some terrible, terrible shocks for them, and probably I would not be around to protect them. And that terror on his face in those scenes was so wonderful, so brilliant. And I thought the rest of the cast, it was, I don't know if you'd ever be able to put a cast like that together again for a made-for-TV movie. It would have to be something like HBO, but even they don't have casts like that anymore. I thought it was wonderful. I said yes because Paul Newman asked me to write it, but the truth is, that was a book that took me about 5 years to write. I immediately went out on book tour with it, and I was on between the hardcover and the paperback, I was on book tour for about 2 years. And then I started immediately writing the screenplay without writing much of anything else in between. Even by the time that I had started the screenplay, I was exhausted. I could barely remember a point in my life before Empire Falls. It was just, everything about the way the book was received, and it did win the prize that year, and all of that. So there was no reason to have any misgivings about the book at all, except that I was just exhausted. And I think that if they had hired someone who had come to that novel new, with fresh eyes, I think that the miniseries would have been better for it. Because what I did, partly out of exhaustion, and partly because I was the author of the novel, was that I tended to solve problems in one medium, that is film, in the same way that I solved those same problems in another medium, which was the novel. And I think a screenwriter, perhaps a more seasoned screenwriter, a person who did that primarily, whereas for me it's kind of a second gig, if they had gotten a set of fresh eyes and a talented screenwriter, then I think the energy and vision of the writing would have been equal to the energy and vision of the direction and the acting and every other aspect of that production. So I look at it now, and I can hear in the voiceover and certain aspects of the way the scenes are structured. I can kind of see my own exhaustion on screen.
About the craft of writing, Stephen King says that all adverbs should be abolished. What's your comment?
Quickly. No, almost all adverb. I wouldn't say all adverbs. I would say like 95% of adverbs, and sometimes a lot of adjectives too. Because sometimes if you just take the trouble to find the right noun, sometimes you don't need that descriptive word next to it. Yeah, I think and Elmore Leonard would go along with all of that too. Yeah, I tend to write long. Well, you can tell from the length of the books, but they're actually longer than that because the last revision is all about cutting and trimming and paring and getting rid of what seemed pretty at the time, and you don't need pretty anymore. And so yeah, things with each subsequent revision, things should be getting more lean, more trim, and adverbs are right at the top of the list, I think. Yeah. You've been a wonderful audience. Thank you so much. Thank you.